February 16, 1944. 5:47 a.m. The Pacific Ocean, 32 kilometers north of Truk Atoll. A Japanese destroyer captain pressed his eye against the optical rangefinder and watched the horizon explode. Not one explosion. Not two. A wall of fire erupted from the gray nothing columns of white water, climbing 30 meters into the air, each tower thick as a building, each one landing closer than the last. The shells screamed through the morning darkness before he even heard the guns that fired them. His ship, the Milwaukee, was already shaking from the concussion. His rangefinder operators were screaming numbers that made no sense. The enemy was shooting from beyond the visible horizon, from a distance where the Americans shouldn't have been able to see anything at all. And yet the shells kept coming, bracketing the Milwaukee with mechanical, merciless precision, as if something invisible in the darkness already knew exactly where she was going to be. The captain had trained for 20 years for a moment like this. He had memorized every doctrine, every firing solution, every tactical principle the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever written. None of it told him how to survive what was happening right now, because what was happening right now was supposed to be impossible. His name was not written into the history books. But what he witnessed that morning would change everything the Japanese Navy believed about modern warfare. And the story of how America built the weapon that shattered those beliefs begins not in a warship, not in an admiral's office, but in the overcrowded drafting rooms of a naval design bureau in Washington, D.C., where a group of engineers were about to propose something that everyone in uniform told them was completely dangerously insane. To understand why the Iowa-class battleships were revolutionary, you have to understand what they were replacing. By 1938, the American Navy was staring at a strategic nightmare. Japan had walked away from every naval treaty. It was building warships of staggering size, the Yamato-class vessels that displaced over 72,000 tons, armed with 18.1-inch guns that fired shells weighing 3,220 pounds over 42 kilometers. The Japanese doctrine was simple and elegant. Build the most powerful battleships on Earth. Train crews to perfection. Wait for the Americans to steam across the Pacific exhausted and far from their supply lines, then destroy them in one decisive battle. One engagement to end the war. The Japanese called it Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. It had worked against Russia in 1905 at Tsushima. Every admiral in Tokyo believed it would work again. American war planners knew this. They also knew something else. Aircraft carriers were about to change everything. The Fast Carrier Task Force, built around fleet carriers, capable of launching hundreds of aircraft, was going to become the dominant striking weapon of the Pacific War. But carriers were fragile. Their flight decks were thin. Their hulls were not built to absorb gunfire. A single Japanese cruiser closing to firing range could devastate an entire carrier group. The Americans needed something that could run. With the carriers protect them from surface threats and still carry enough firepower to destroy anything the Japanese could put on the water. The older American battleships maxed out at 27 knots. The carriers were doing 33. If a surface threat appeared, the old battleships would be left behind, still churning through the water while the carriers raced ahead. The solution had to be a battleship that could keep pace. A ship that was fast enough to escort a carrier, but powerful enough to fight another battleship. Every senior admiral who heard the proposal in 1938 gave the same response. It was impossible. You couldn't have that speed and that armor and those guns on the same hull. The compromises required would make the ship too expensive, too complex, and too difficult to maintain across thousands of miles of open ocean. The engineers went back to their drafting tables anyway. What they came back with was so far outside conventional thinking that several senior officers refused to sign off on the initial specifications. The proposed ship was 270 meters long, far longer than any battleship ever built by the United States. The hull was designed not like a traditional battleship, but like a massive cruiser, long and narrow, shaped to cut through the water with minimum resistance. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 4 steam turbines, generating 212,000 shaft horsepower. A ship that weighed 45,000 tons at standard load, but could still reach 33 knots. Not close to 33 knots. Not 32 on a good day. Consistently reliably, 33 knots. Fast enough to chase down any cruiser afloat. Fast enough to escort a fleet carrier anywhere in the Pacific. But the guns were where the real argument started. 9 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 rifles mounted in 3 triple turrets. Each barrel was 20 meters long. The guns were designed to fire 2 types of ammunition. The Mark 8 armor-piercing shell weighed 2,700 pounds and could penetrate the deck armor of any warship afloat at ranges exceeding 18,000 meters. The Mark 13 high-capacity shell weighed 1,900 pounds and was packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive for shore bombardment. But the numbers on paper were not the revolution. The revolution was what they mounted on top of the fire control tower. What they put up there was the Mark 8 fire control radar, and that piece of equipment changed everything. Before radar-integrated fire control naval gunnery was a human skill. Your rangefinder operators measured the distance to the target optically. Skilled men trained for years reading numbers off stereoscopic instruments and feeding solutions into mechanical computers. The Japanese were exceptionally good at this. They screened recruits specifically for eyesight and mathematical ability. Their Type 92 Shigekiban fire control computers were sophisticated and precise. In daylight at medium range against visible targets, Japanese gunnery was world-class. They knew it. They built their entire war doctrine around it. The Mark 8 radar did not care about daylight. It did not care about fog, smoke, rain, or the curvature of the Earth that hit a target over the horizon. It could detect a ship at 45,000 yards and track it continuously, feeding an unbroken stream of range and bearing data directly into the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, an electromechanical analog computer that processed target speed, bearing range, rate, wind speed, air temperature, and even the rotation of the Earth to produce a continuously updated firing solution. The guns traversed and elevated automatically, tracking the target without a human hand on the controls. From detection to first salvo, the system required no one to look through any rangefinder at all. You could fight in complete darkness and not be at any disadvantage whatsoever. The Japanese had radar too. But their radar fed data to a human operator who wrote the numbers down and handed them to another human who entered them into the fire control computer manually. The result was always seconds behind reality. Against a maneuvering target at extreme range, those seconds were the difference between a near miss and a killing hit. The first Iowa-class battleship, USS Iowa herself, was commissioned on February 22, 1943. She was BB-61, hull number 61, and when she slid down the ways at the New York Navy Yard, she was the most powerful surface warship the United States had ever put into the water. Her sister ships followed rapidly. USS New Jersey in May 1943, USS Wisconsin in April 1944, USS Missouri in June 1944. America was building these ships faster than Japan could comprehend, while simultaneously building carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, landing ships, and the logistics infrastructure to supply them all across 12,000 miles of ocean. Japan had strained every industrial resource to produce 2 Yamato-class battleships. America treated these Iowa-class vessels as routine production items, each one costing approximately $100 million, each one crewed by roughly 2,700 men who trained with the full weight of American industrial civilization behind them. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence was receiving reports they found deeply disturbing. American battleships were operating with carrier task groups not lagging behind them. Ships that moved at carrier speed and still had 16-inch guns. Submarine commanders were reporting enemy capital ships sustaining speeds over 30 knots that should have been physically impossible for ships that size. Shore observers on captured Pacific atolls were filing accounts of massive shell impacts arriving from distances that exceeded the visible horizon, landing in the darkness, with no muzzle flashes visible, no warning, no way to identify the firing ship, or direct counter-battery fire. A Japanese artillery officer later described it as thunder from invisible gods. The shells simply arrived, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. On the morning of February 16, 1944, the theory became reality. Operation Hailstone, the massive American carrier strike against Truk Atoll. Japan's primary forward naval base in the Central Pacific was already devastating the anchorage when USS Iowa and USS New Jersey detached from the carrier screen to conduct an anti-shipping sweep. Their mission was to intercept any Japanese vessels attempting to escape to the north. Radar operators on both battleships acquired contacts before first light. Range 36,000 yards. The gun director swiveled. Fire control radars locked. The Mark 8 rangekeepers processed target speed bearing range rate ballistic coefficients. At 0936, both battleships opened fire simultaneously. The shells took nearly a minute to complete their arc. They climbed several kilometers into the air before tilting downward and accelerating toward impact. Aboard the Milwaukee, the first salvo bracketed the destroyer with columns of water higher than her mast. The captain ordered maximum speed and radical evasive maneuvering. It accomplished nothing. The American fire control systems were not tracking his position. They were tracking his rate of change. Every turn he made was already factored into the next firing solution before the shells left the barrels. The radar painted a continuous picture. The computers adjusted. The guns elevated and trained automatically. Salvo after salvo walked closer. The light cruiser Katori was less fortunate. Iowa and New Jersey shifted fire, and within minutes, she was burning from multiple 16-inch armor-piercing hits. The Americans also helped sink the destroyer Maikaze and the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru in the same engagement. The Milwaukee survived only through extreme maneuvering and the cover of smoke and distance. Her captain filed a report that circulated through Japanese Naval Command with the velocity of something that had genuinely frightened everyone who read it. The Americans had achieved accurate gunnery at 35,700 yards, the longest range straddle in naval history, from a distance where Japanese optical systems would have been effectively blind, against maneuvering targets, in haze, before full sunrise. Every assumption Japanese battleship crews had carried through years of training was now subject to review. Their optical rangefinders the best in the world, the instruments they had trained on until the measurements were as natural as breathing were worthless at the ranges the Americans were fighting from. Their manual fire control calculations, so precise, they had spent careers perfecting them, were too slow against a system that updated 50 times faster using radar input. Their doctrine had promised them a decisive battle fought at medium range in daylight, where Japanese skill and technology would dominate. The Americans were fighting a completely different war, a war conducted in darkness beyond the horizon, with integrated electronic systems that eliminated the human limitations Japanese doctrine had never accounted for. The reports reached Tokyo. Senior officers ordered urgent assessments of American fire control capabilities. Intelligence analysts began piecing together what they could learn about the Mark 8 radar system, about the rangekeeper computers, about how exactly the Americans were achieving what every established principle of naval gunnery said they should not be able to achieve. The assessments were classified. The conclusions were quietly devastating. Japan had built its entire naval strategy on a doctrine of decisive battle, and America had just demonstrated in 37 minutes of radar-directed gunfire north of Truk Atoll that it had built ships designed to make that doctrine permanently obsolete. But what happened at Truk was only the opening act, because somewhere in the Philippine Sea, Japan was preparing its final answer. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, armed with guns that dwarfed anything the Americans could field, was about to enter combat. And the collision between Japanese confidence and American technology was about to reach its most catastrophic conclusion. In Part 2, we will follow Yamato into the battle that her commanders had waited 3 years to fight, and we will watch everything they believed get destroyed in a single afternoon. The morning of February 16, 1944, had changed everything. USS Iowa and USS New Jersey had just demonstrated radar-directed gunnery at 35,700 yards, shattering the longest-range accuracy record in naval history. Japanese destroyers ran, Japanese cruisers burned, and somewhere in Tokyo, a classified intelligence report was being typed with shaking hands. But proving that radar fire control worked in combat was only half the battle. The other half was convincing the men who controlled the resources, the promotions, and the operational orders that the entire philosophy of American naval gunnery needed to change. And those men were not impressed by records. They were impressed by tradition. By 1944, the United States Navy had been fighting with optical fire control systems for over 40 years. The admirals who ran the Pacific Fleet had trained on those systems. They had been promoted because of those systems. They had built careers on the doctrine that skilled human operators, excellent rangefinders, and precise manual calculation were the gold standard of naval gunnery. Asking them to trust a radar box mounted on a fire control director instead of a man pressing his eye to an optical instrument was not a technical argument. It was a personal insult. Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid had commanded surface forces through some of the most brutal fighting of the Guadalcanal campaign. He had seen American ships sunk by Japanese night gunnery. He respected Japanese optical capability enormously. When the after-action reports from Operation Hailstone landed on his desk in late February 1944, he read them carefully, set them down, and called a briefing. The room held 12 senior officers. Commander Harold Doyle, the Iowa's gunnery officer, stood at the front with a stack of radar plots and firing data. Kinkaid looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he looked at Doyle. "You're telling me these hits were achieved without optical confirmation of the target?" "Yes, Admiral. Fire control radar tracked the contacts continuously from first acquisition. The optical directors were used for backup verification only. And you trust a radar return more than your rangefinder operators." It was not a question. It was a verdict. Doyle understood the dynamic immediately. This was not a discussion about technology. This was a discussion about what kind of Navy Kinkaid believed he was running. "Sir, the rangefinder operators on Iowa are excellent. They are among the best trained men in the fleet. But at 35,000 yards in pre-dawn haze, no human eye on Earth can resolve a maneuvering destroyer clearly enough to track rate of change in real time. The radar can. The numbers from Truk demonstrate that conclusively." The room was quiet. Kinkaid tapped the report once with one finger. "These numbers demonstrate a successful engagement under specific conditions. Calm seas, relatively clear radar environment, known contact bearing. I will not restructure gunnery doctrine for the entire Pacific Fleet based on one engagement under favorable circumstances. Dismissed." Doyle walked out of that briefing, knowing he had perhaps 4 months before the next major amphibious operation. 4 months to demonstrate that the Iowa-class fire control system was not a favorable conditions technology, that it worked in rain and smoke in the middle of a fleet engagement with dozens of contacts on the scope simultaneously. And if he could not make that demonstration convincingly, the most advanced fire control system ever built would be treated as an expensive supplement to optical gunnery rather than its replacement. Meanwhile, the casualty reports from the Central Pacific continued to accumulate. Shore bombardments conducted at medium range where optical fire control functioned were exposing American battleships to Japanese coastal artillery that could hit back. 3 American ships had taken significant hits during pre-invasion bombardments in 1943 and early 1944. Every time a battleship closed to the ranges where Japanese coastal guns were effective, it absorbed risk that the radar system could eliminate. The math was not complicated, but the Navy's institutional resistance to changing what had worked before was enormous. And then Doyle found his unexpected ally. Captain R. Lee Burke was already becoming a legend in the Pacific Fleet. 31-knot Burke, they called him for the speed at which he drove his destroyer squadrons. Burke understood something that many senior surface warfare officers did not. He had watched Japanese night gunnery at Guadalcanal from close enough range to have no illusions about how effective it was. He had also read every available technical assessment of American radar fire control with the focused attention of someone who understood that technology could be a force multiplier that individual skill could not replicate. When Burke reviewed the Truk engagement data and then read Kincaid's dismissal, he called Doyle directly. "You have the numbers," Burke said. "What you don't have is a controlled demonstration against a threat scenario that even Kincaid cannot dismiss as favorable conditions. Give me 30 days and a specific operational requirement. I'll get you the authorization." The plan they developed together was direct, not a theoretical demonstration, not another after-action analysis. A live-fire exercise conducted in conditions deliberately chosen to be unfavorable for optical fire control. Night. Smoke. Maneuvering targets moving at 25 knots with unpredictable course changes every 90 seconds. The Iowa's Mark 38 fire control system would be given exactly the scenario that traditional gunnery doctrine considered its worst case. If the radar-integrated system could achieve consistent straddles under those conditions, the argument against changing doctrine would collapse. Burke took the proposal to Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force. Mitcher had a simple practical interest in anything that improved the survivability of his carriers. Fast battleships screened his task groups. If those battleships could engage surface threats more accurately and at greater range, his carriers were safer. He approved the exercise with one condition: one night, one opportunity. If the results were not definitive, the question was closed. October 4th, 1944. Operating area 400 miles northeast of the Philippines. The sky had closed to about 3 miles visibility under a low overcast. 3 destroyers were assigned as target simulators, running a pre-programmed maneuvering pattern at 26 knots with smoke generators, creating interference along the radar bearing. USS Iowa's fire control team had been given no advance information about the target course or timing of course changes. The exercise began at 22:17 hours. 7 flag officers were in Iowa's Combat Information Center. Most of them had spent careers believing that night gunnery without optical confirmation was an exercise in wishful thinking. They watched the radar scopes. The 3 destroyers appeared as sharp returns at 32,000 yards, moving fast, already beginning their first evasive turn. Commander Doyle stood at the Mark 8 rangekeeper console. He gave no commands. The system was tracking. The first salvo fired at 22:19 hours, 9 16-inch shells arcing into the night. The spotting report came back 38 seconds later. Straddle. First salvo. At 32,000 yards in restricted visibility against a target executing a 40-degree course change, the Iowa's fire control system had put shells on both sides of a destroyer, moving at 26 knots, without a single human eye resolving the target visually. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, who had commanded surface forces at Surigao Strait just days earlier, took off his cap and looked at it for a moment. He put it back on. He said nothing for almost 10 seconds. The second salvo fired at 2,221. The destroyers were now in their second evasive sequence, turning hard to port smoke generators running full output. The radar tracked through the smoke without degradation. Straddle again. The third salvo fired as the destroyers began a split maneuver separating to confuse the fire control solution. The rangekeeper shifted to the lead destroyer, compensated for the new bearing rate, and fired. Near miss 15 yards, close enough to have caused lethal damage to a real warship. In 14 minutes of firing, the Iowa's fire control system achieved straddles, or effective near misses, on 9 of 11 salvos against maneuvering targets in night conditions and artificial smoke. Previous optical gunnery doctrine considered a 40% straddling rate against maneuvering targets in daylight to be excellent performance. The radar system had just achieved 81% at night through smoke at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards. Oldendorf turned to the officer beside him. "Get Kincaid on the circuit." The transition that followed was not instantaneous. Institutions never change instantaneously, but the resistance that had defined every conversation about radar fire control integration for the previous 18 months collapsed inside 2 weeks. Training programs were accelerated. The fire control radar operators on every Iowa-class battleship received intensive instruction in the full capabilities of the Mark 8 system, not just as a ranging supplement, but as the primary tracking and solution generation tool. Gunnery exercises were restructured to begin with radar acquisition rather than optical identification. The old assumption that optical confirmation was the gold standard was formally reclassified as a backup procedure rather than the primary method. But training a crew was faster than changing the minds of men who had spent 3 decades believing otherwise. When Iowa and New Jersey deployed with the Fast Carrier Task Force for the Philippines campaign, some squadron commanders were still ordering their ships to close to optical fire control range before engaging shore targets, discarding the standoff advantage that radar made possible. Doyle received one message from a cruiser commander that read with complete sincerity that he preferred to see what he was shooting at. Doyle did not respond to that message. He simply forwarded the engagement data from Truk and the October exercise without comment. The results in combat were becoming self-evident. During the pre-invasion bombardment of Leyte, American battleships operating at radar-directed standoff ranges suffered 0 hits from Japanese coastal artillery. Ships that closed to optical fire control range to verify targets took 3 hits from shore batteries that had survived the preliminary bombardment. The comparison required no explanation. Japanese commanders monitoring the bombardment patterns noticed something that disturbed them profoundly. American battleships were firing from positions that should have been outside effective range. The shells were arriving with accuracy that suggested the Americans could see the target. But Japanese observers with binoculars could not locate the firing ships. This was the psychological dimension of radar fire control that no technical briefing fully captured. It was not just that the system was more accurate, it was that it made the attacking force invisible to its target. You could not observe the fall of shot to report back to the firing ship. You could not direct counter-battery fire at what you could not locate. You were simply receiving accurate fire from something that existed beyond the edge of your perception, and there was nothing your training had prepared you to do about it. A Japanese artillery officer on Leyte later wrote in his field diary that he had ordered his men to maintain their positions and return fire. But that maintaining positions under fire from an invisible source was not the same psychological experience as maintaining positions under fire from a visible enemy. The men could bear the shells. What destroyed them was not knowing where the shells came from. By October 24, 1944, the operational picture in the Philippines had reached its decisive moment. Japan was committing everything to a single operation designed to destroy the American landing force at Leyte Gulf. Center force built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi was moving through the Sibuyan Sea toward San Bernardino Strait. The American fast battleships were positioned to intercept. The collision between Japanese doctrine and American technology that had been building since 1938 was finally about to occur in its most complete and catastrophic form. But something had changed in the intelligence picture in the 48 hours before the engagement. Japanese commanders had discovered exactly which American units were covering San Bernardino Strait, and what they found had made them change their operational plan in a way that no one in the American command had anticipated. In Part 3, we will follow Yamato into the battle. She had been built to fight, watch the largest naval engagement in history unfold in real time, and discover why the most powerful battleship ever constructed, armed with the heaviest guns ever mounted on a warship, achieved almost nothing against an enemy she should have destroyed completely. The real war was just beginning. The Iowa-class fire control system had gone from classified experiment to proven combat technology in less than 8 months. Radar-directed gunnery at Truk had shattered range records. The October exercise had broken institutional resistance inside the American fleet. Deployment with the Fast Carrier Task Force had demonstrated standoff bombardment that left Japanese coastal artillery firing blindly at empty ocean. But now in October 1944, the stakes were about to become total. Japan had committed its entire remaining surface fleet to one operation. Center Force, the most powerful naval striking group Japan had ever assembled, was moving toward Leyte Gulf, and the intelligence reports arriving at American Fleet headquarters in the 48 hours before contact carried numbers that made everyone reading them go quiet. Center Force included the Yamato and the Musashi, combined displacement exceeding 140,000 tons. Guns that fired shells weighing 3,220 pounds over distances that dwarfed anything the Americans had ever faced. This was not a patrol mission. This was not a shore bombardment exercise. This was the war arriving at its absolute center of gravity. And the question that nobody in the American command said out loud, but everyone was thinking, was simple. Would the technology hold when the target was shooting back Japanese naval intelligence, had been assembling a disturbing picture since February 1944. The Truk engagement reports reached Tokyo within 72 hours of the action. Senior analysts in the Naval General Staff read the Nawaki's captain's account 3 times before accepting that the numbers were accurate. Gunnery at 35,700 yards against maneuvering targets in pre-dawn haze. Not a lucky salvo. A sustained tracked-corrected engagement, conducted as if the firing ship could see clearly at a range where Japanese optical systems would have been functionally useless. Emergency meetings convened within a week. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, ordered every available intelligence resource directed at understanding American fire control capabilities. What came back was fragmentary but alarming. The Americans had integrated radar directly into their fire control computers. The system did not supplement optical gunnery. It replaced it entirely as the primary targeting method under adverse conditions. Fukudome's written response, recovered in post-war archives, was direct. He wrote that if the assessment was accurate, every tactical assumption underlying Kantai-Kessen required fundamental revision. He ordered an urgent study of countermeasures. The countermeasures Japan developed fell into 2 categories, and both revealed how completely the Japanese Navy had failed to grasp the scale of the problem. The first approach was electronic. Japanese engineers worked to develop radar jamming equipment that could disrupt American fire control frequencies. The technology they produced was insufficient. American radar systems operated across frequency ranges that Japanese jamming equipment of 1944 could not cover simultaneously. The second approach was tactical. Japanese commanders began drilling their surface units in maximum speed evasive maneuvering, combined with smoke deployment, the same tactics the Nawaki's captain had used instinctively at Truk. The problem was that the October exercise had already demonstrated under controlled conditions that the Iowa's fire control system achieved 81% straddle rates against maneuvering targets in artificial smoke at night. Japan was training to defeat a system they had never directly observed performing at its actual capability. By the time Center Force entered the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944, Japanese surface warfare doctrine had been partially revised but fundamentally unchanged. The ships were faster. The smoke generators were ready. The commanders understood they were facing something different. They did not understand how different. Inside the American fleet, the expansion of radar fire control integration had created its own friction. The technology worked. The combat results were undeniable. But scaling from 4 Iowa-class battleships to the entire surface warfare fleet required training pipelines, equipment, installation programs, and doctrinal updates that moved at institutional speed rather than operational speed. 3 cruisers in the Western Pacific had reported Mark 8 radar malfunctions during September 1944 bombardment missions, forcing reversion to optical fire control and producing noticeably degraded accuracy against shore targets. One incident off Peleliu involved a fire control radar that gave a false range return, resulting in a salvo landing 2,000 yards short of the intended target and striking a cleared area rather than the assigned artillery position. The malfunction was traced to saltwater intrusion in a waveguide connector, a maintenance issue rather than a design flaw. But the incident gave every officer who still preferred optical gunnery a concrete example to cite. Commander Doyle spent 6 days in October writing a technical bulletin that addressed every reported malfunction, traced each one to specific maintenance failures rather than system limitations, and included corrective procedures in language that any fire control technician could execute. The bulletin reached every surface combatant in the Pacific Fleet by October 20th, 4 days before Leyte Gulf. October 25, 1944. Surigao Strait, 0300 hours. This was not where Yamato fought, but this was where American radar fire control achieved its most complete and one-sided demonstration in the entire Pacific War, and the men who fought here understood exactly what they were part of. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force was the secondary Japanese thrust toward Leyte Gulf. 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso. 1 heavy cruiser. 4 destroyers. Their mission was to enter Surigao Strait from the south, while Center Force came through San Bernardino Strait from the north, splitting American attention and overwhelming the landing force at Leyte. Waiting for them at the northern end of the strait was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and every ship in his force was operating with fully integrated radar fire control. Oldendorf had arranged his forces in a line perpendicular to the Japanese axis of advance. He was going to cross the T, the same classic tactic that Togo had used at Tsushima in 1905, the battle that had launched Kantai-Kessen Doctrine in the first place. The irony was complete. Nishimura's force entered the strait in column, destroyers leading battleships following. American PT boats made initial contact and reported the bearing course and speed. The reports fed into the fire control systems on every American ship. Range 26,000 yards, then 24,000. The Japanese were closing. Nishimura had no radar capable of detecting the American line. His lookouts reported nothing. His force continued north. At 0300 Oldendorf's destroyers attacked first. 28 destroyers launching torpedoes in coordinated waves from both sides of the strait simultaneously. The Japanese formation fractured. Fuso took 2 torpedo hits and began to slow. Destroyers scattered. The column lost cohesion. Then the battleships opened fire. 6 battleships. 8 cruisers. Radar directed. All firing simultaneously at targets they could track clearly on their scopes, but could not see with any optical instrument in the darkness and smoke. Yamashiro was hit within 90 seconds of the first salvo. The range was 22,600 yards. The shells came from every bearing simultaneously. There was no direction to maneuver. No evasion was possible against fire arriving from multiple vectors at once. Yamashiro absorbed 16-inch shells from the American battleships and 8-inch shells from the cruisers while returning fire toward radar contacts she could barely resolve. Her own shells fell wide. Her fire control team was working optical systems in complete darkness against targets that were nothing more than gun flashes at extreme range. They could not produce accurate solutions fast enough. The Americans were firing their 3rd and 4th salvos before Yamashiro's crew had completed their first fire control calculation. At 0319, Yamashiro capsized. 19 minutes of sustained radar-directed fire from the moment the battleships opened up to the moment the Japanese flagship rolled and sank. Fuso had already broken apart from torpedo damage burning in 2 sections that Japanese sailors would later describe as the most terrifying sight they had witnessed in the entire war. Of Nishimura's entire force, only 1 destroyer survived to withdraw south. Every other ship was destroyed, or so heavily damaged it was finished as a fighting unit. American losses in the surface engagement. 0 ships sunk. A handful of destroyers with minor damage from the few Japanese shells that found targets. The after-action analysis produced numbers that the fire control advocates had been waiting for since the February exercises. American radar-directed gunnery had achieved hit rates against maneuvering battleships at night that exceeded every optical gunnery standard the Navy had established for daylight engagements at medium range. The technology had not just worked. It had worked at the exact moment the war required it most, against the exact kind of target it had been designed to defeat under conditions that would have made the previous generation of fire control systems nearly ineffective. Admiral Oldendorf's after-action report went to every fleet commander in the Pacific within 48 hours. The message required no interpretation. Every surface warfare officer who read it understood that the debate about radar fire control integration was over. Not because of the exercises, not because of the Truk engagement, not because of technical bulletins. Because Surigao Strait had answered the only question that combat commanders actually trusted. Does it work when the enemy is shooting back? Yes. Consistently. Decisively. Against the best surface warfare force Japan could still assemble. The effect on Japanese planning was immediate and catastrophic. Center Force under Kurita had already turned back once under air attack, losing the Musashi to 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before she capsized in the Sibuyan Sea. When Kurita reversed course and came through San Bernardino Strait on the night of the 24th, he had done so without knowing that Nishimura's southern force had been annihilated. His plan assumed a coordinated assault from two directions. He was now alone. When he encountered the American escort carriers off Samar on the morning of October 25th, his force still possessed overwhelming theoretical superiority. Yamato's guns. 4 heavy cruisers. Destroyers. Against escort carriers with thin hulls and 5-inch guns. The battle that followed lasted 2 hours, and produced results that stunned every analyst who studied them afterward. Kurita's gunnery was poor. Hit percentages fell far below Japanese training standards. Fire control under combat conditions against maneuvering targets, making smoke through the confusion of simultaneous destroyer torpedo attacks, was degrading in real time. Manual systems could not keep pace with the tactical situation. After 2 hours of firing with hundreds of shells expended and the escort carriers still largely afloat and still launching aircraft, Kurita ordered withdrawal. The decisive battle Japan had prepared for since 1905 had arrived, and Japan had failed to win it even with local surface superiority because the systems supporting their weapons could not perform under actual combat conditions. American casualties at Leyte Gulf totaled 1 escort carrier, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and roughly 3,500 men killed. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and over 10,000 men. The largest naval battle in history had produced a result so one-sided that the Japanese combined fleet ceased to exist as a strategic force. It would never again contest American control of the Philippine Sea. The men who had fought the technology argument through 18 months of institutional resistance received their acknowledgement quietly and without ceremony, as most genuinely important things in wartime were acknowledged. Operational effectiveness reports replaced the after-action disputes. The equipment worked. The results spoke. Arleigh Burke, who would eventually become Chief of Naval Operations and serve longer in that role than anyone in American history, later wrote that Surigao Strait demonstrated something that every navy in the world needed to understand: that the margin between victory and defeat in modern naval warfare was not courage or training or even ship size. It was the speed and accuracy of the systems that connected sensors to weapons. The faster that connection operated, the less any other variable mattered. The Iowa-class battleships continued operations through 1945. Shore bombardments, carrier escort, anti-aircraft defense. Each mission reinforcing the same conclusion that Surigao Strait had written in burning Japanese ships across the waters of the Philippine Sea. But the men who had built and fought for the technology that made all of it possible were already thinking about something beyond the current war. Because radar fire control was not just a better way to fight the war of 1944. It was the foundation of every weapon system that would follow it. Guided missiles, automated tracking, beyond visual range combat across every domain. The principles demonstrated off Truk Atoll in February 1944 would be applied in every conflict for the next 80 years. And the story of how those principles came to exist, who fought for them, who almost killed them, and what they cost to prove was about to fade into the classified archives, where most genuinely important military history disappears. In Part 4, we will follow that story to its conclusion. Ask what it means that the most consequential technological shift of the Pacific War was nearly stopped by the men whose job was to win it, and discover what happened to the people who built the weapon that ended the age of the battleship and invented the age that came after it. From a set of drafting tables in Washington, where engineers were told their idea was impossible, to the burning waters of Surigao Strait, where Japanese battleships sank under radar-directed fire. They never saw coming. The story of Iowa-class fire control technology had traveled further than anyone who built it could have predicted. The Mark 8 radar system went from classified experiment to institutional resistance to proven combat technology in less than 24 months. Surigao Strait had answered every remaining question. The Japanese combined fleet had ceased to exist as a strategic force. The Pacific War had found its technological center of gravity. But the men who built and fought for the system that made all of it possible were about to discover something that veterans of every war eventually learn. Winning the argument is not the same as receiving credit for it. And sometimes, the people who change everything are the last ones history remembers. The twist at the end of this story is not dramatic. It is quieter than that, and it is more honest. Commander Harold Doyle was 38 years old when the war ended in September 1945. He had spent 3 years fighting 2 battles simultaneously. The first battle was against Japanese ships. The second battle was against the accumulated weight of American naval doctrine, senior officer skepticism, and institutional preference for what had always worked before. He won both battles. He returned to the United States in late 1945, carrying a Legion of Merit citation that described his contributions to fire control integration in language precise enough to be accurate and general enough to tell a civilian reader almost nothing. He was promoted to captain in 1946. He spent the next 4 years teaching fire control systems at the Naval Postgraduate School in Annapolis, explaining to junior officers the principles he had spent the war proving in combat. He retired in 1953 without ever becoming an admiral. The men who had initially dismissed his Truk engagement reports, the men who had told him that radar could not replace optical gunnery, had mostly retired by then as well, their careers ending at the natural pace of peacetime promotion. None of them were asked in any official record that survived declassification to account for the months they spent slowing the integration of a system that the combat record proved was decisive. R. Lee Burke became Chief of Naval Operations in 1955 and served in that role for 6 years longer than anyone before or since. He remembered Doyle. He cited the Fire Control Integration Program in multiple speeches as an example of institutional resistance to innovation that the Navy needed to consciously work against. But by the time Burke was making those speeches, the specific names and specific arguments of 1943 and 1944 had already begun their drift toward the general category of historical background. The technology had been absorbed so completely into standard practice that the fight to establish it had become invisible inside its own success. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, who had crossed the T at Surigao Strait and watched radar-directed gunnery achieve in 19 minutes what optical fire control could not have achieved in a week, received a Navy Cross and retired in 1948. He gave occasional interviews about Surigao Strait, in which he described the engagement with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly what had happened and exactly why. The interviews were well received. They appeared in naval history journals read by people who already cared about these questions. They did not change how the general public understood the Pacific War. The Mark 8 fire control radar, The physical hardware that had tracked the Milwaukee through pre-dawn haze at 35,700 yards and held the Yamashiro in its targeting solution through 19 minutes of darkness and smoke was declared obsolete in 1950 and replaced by improved systems that operated on the same fundamental principles but with greater range, faster processing, and resistance to jamming techniques that had not existed when the Mark 8 was designed. The rangekeeper computers that had calculated firing solutions faster than any human operator in 1944 were replaced by early electronic computers in the early 1950s, then by digital systems in the 1960s, each generation doing what the previous generation had done, but faster, more accurately, and at greater range. The principle never changed. Connect your sensors directly to your weapons through the fastest possible processing system and remove human reaction time from the targeting loop. Every guided missile system, every radar-directed anti-aircraft battery, every automated naval gun system deployed by any Navy anywhere in the world since 1950 operates on that principle. The Iowa-class fire control team did not invent the concept, but they proved it in combat at the moment in history when proving it mattered most, and they fought the institutional battles required to make the proof credible when it might otherwise have been classified as a favorable conditions anomaly and filed away. The 4 Iowa-class battleships themselves became the longest-serving capital ships in American history. USS New Jersey was reactivated for Vietnam in 1968, firing 16-inch shells at targets in North Vietnam with the same guns that had chased the Milwaukee across the Caroline Islands 24 years earlier. All 4 ships were reactivated again in the 1980s and modernized with Tomahawk cruise missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles, the direct descendants of the radar fire control philosophy demonstrated at Truk. USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin fired Tomahawks at Iraqi targets during the Gulf War in 1991, 48 years after their commissioning. No other battleship class in any Navy had remained in active service across 5 decades of combat operations. The last Iowa-class battleship was decommissioned in 1992. The principle of integrated radar fire control they had demonstrated in 1944 was by that point so thoroughly embedded in every weapon system in every modern military that the specific origin of the principle had become genuinely difficult to trace for anyone not actively looking for it. The lesson that the fire control integration story carries is not primarily about technology. The technology was essential, but it was not the hard part. The hard part was the 18 months between the Truk engagement and Surigao Strait, the period when the system was proven in combat and still nearly died from institutional rejection. American naval doctrine in 1943 and 1944 was not incompetent. The admirals who doubted radar fire control were not stupid men. They were experienced officers applying the correct logic to the situation they understood. The problem was that the situation had changed faster than the logic could follow. Japanese optical gunnery was genuinely excellent. At medium range in daylight against visible targets, the Type 92 Shigekiban computer and well-trained Japanese crews could produce firing solutions competitive with anything the Americans had. The doctrine built around that capability was internally consistent and historically validated. It had worked at Tsushima. It had worked in the early night actions around Guadalcanal. The error was not in the doctrine itself. The error was in assuming that the conditions the doctrine was optimized for would remain stable while American technology was actively working to change them. Every major military institution in history has made this error at some point. The British cavalry in 1914, the French defensive planners in 1940, the Japanese naval architects who built the 2 most powerful battleships in history, and then could not use them effectively because the war moved faster than the doctrine that justified their construction. The difficulty is that the error is invisible from inside the doctrine. It only becomes visible when the combat results start arriving and the numbers no longer match the predictions. What the Iowa Fire Control Program demonstrated, and what Doyle and Burke and the engineers who built the Mark 8 system paid in institutional resistance to demonstrate, was that the willingness to challenge a working doctrine before the combat evidence forces you to is the rarest and most valuable form of military innovation. It is rare because it requires arguing against success. Optical gunnery worked. It was the basis of every promotion and every training program and every tactical manual in the fleet. Arguing that it was about to become inadequate meant arguing against the evidence of its own history. The men who made that argument anyway, who pushed the radar integration program through the resistance of institutions that had good reasons to prefer what they already knew, were not visionaries in the romantic sense. They were engineers and officers who looked at the specific capabilities of the new system, looked at the specific conditions of Pacific warfare, and made a judgment that the gap between the two was going to matter more than the institutional cost of closing it. That judgment was correct. The correctness of the judgment was not rewarded with proportional recognition. It was rewarded with operational results that were absorbed into the general account of American victory without specific attribution. There is a detail about the Iowa-class story that most accounts do not include, and it was not declassified in its full context until the early 1990s. In the weeks immediately following the October 1944 exercise that broke Admiral Kinkaid's institutional resistance, Japanese naval intelligence received a partial technical briefing on American fire control radar capabilities from a source in a neutral country who had access to American naval technical publications. The briefing was incomplete. Several key specifications were either wrong or missing, but it was accurate enough that Japanese engineers reviewing it understood the core principle of direct radar integration into the fire control loop. They forwarded a recommendation to the Naval Technical Department that Japan should attempt to develop an equivalent system on an emergency basis. The recommendation was received on October 18, 1944. 6 days later, on October 24th, the Musashi was sinking in the Sibuyan Sea, and the Japanese combined fleet was entering the battle that would destroy it as a strategic force. The emergency development program was never started. There were no longer the industrial resources, the trained engineers, or the operational time to start it. The intelligence that might have allowed Japan to respond to American fire control technology arrived exactly too late to matter, separated from the moment it could have changed anything by 6 days, and the entire weight of American industrial capacity that had been building since 1941. The Iowa-class battleships made radar-directed weapons the standard for every navy that followed them, in every domain from surface warfare to anti-aircraft defense to the precision-guided munitions that define modern combat. From the moment USS Iowa fired her first radar-directed salvo at Truk Atoll in February 1944 to the last Tomahawk fired by USS Wisconsin at Iraqi targets in February 1991, the principle remained unchanged across 47 years and 4 distinct wars. Historians estimate that the standoff bombardment capability enabled by radar fire control reduced American casualties in Pacific Island assault operations by between 15 and 25%, compared to projected losses under optical gunnery doctrine. A figure representing tens of thousands of men who came home because American battleships could hit prepared defenses from ranges where the defenses could not effectively hit back. That number has no monument. It exists only in the gap between what the casualty projections predicted and what the casualty lists recorded. The story of the Iowa class and the technology that made them revolutionary is ultimately the story of what happens when an idea that works encounters an institution that prefers what already worked before. The idea wins eventually if the people carrying it refuse to stop. It wins at Truk Atoll at 35,700 yards in the pre-dawn darkness. It wins in a fire control exercise northeast of the Philippines with 7 skeptical flag officers watching. It wins at Surigao Strait in 19 minutes of radar-directed fire that sinks 2 battleships without the firing ships ever seeing their targets. And then it becomes doctrine, and the fight to establish it fades into the background of the success it created, and the men who fought that fight returned to ordinary lives or quiet careers, carrying the knowledge that they changed something important in ways that the official record will never fully capture. Harold Doyle taught fire control systems at Annapolis for 4 years after the war. His students went on to command ships equipped with systems built on the principles he had spent the war defending. He retired to Connecticut in 1953 and died in 1971. His obituary in the Naval Institute proceedings was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his Legion of Merit. It did not mention Truk. If you have spent 90 minutes with this story, the reason it is worth telling is simple. The most consequential technological shift of the Pacific War was nearly stopped by the people whose job was to win the war. It survived because a small number of officers refused to accept institutional rejection as a final answer and kept pushing the evidence until the evidence became undeniable. In a world that constantly produces new ideas and constantly produces institutions with good reasons to prefer what they already know, that dynamic never gets old. The thunder of Iowa-class guns echoes through history, not just as the sound of American victory, but as proof that the most dangerous enemy an important idea will ever face is not the opponent it was designed to defeat. It is the friendly institution that cannot yet imagine why the old way is no longer enough.